This day, 45 years ago, it was the 13th of June. It was a Sunday. Young people met at the DOCC at Orlando East in Soweto, and they were led by C.H. Mashinini and a leadership of the South African Students Movement. And they met, they took a decision. June 16 will be the day to march against Africans and the institution of Africans as a form of teaching at high schools. It was never known that that was going to lead to a massacre of young people. It was never known that a lot of those young people would then have to leave the country and live lives across lands and live lives outside of their country in pursuit of struggle, in pursuit of a better life for their own folk and for Black people who were oppressed at the time. Welcome to the Azapo Online Political Education session. And today, as we continue with the program to commemorate the June 16 uprisings, I am here with young people who found themselves in exiled lands and who grew up in exiled lands, not out of choice, but out of circumstance. I am with Pheto Mangena. He was born in Botswana, raised in Zimbabwe until 1994. That is when he came back to the country. And on arrival, he moved to Polokwane, where he completed his high school education before studying medicine at the University of Cape Town. He is now working as a specialist physician and a nephrologist at Pietersburg Hospital, and also works as a senior lecturer in the School of Medicine at the University of Limpopo. He is also with Paul Lingane, who is a senior media executive, expert in broadcasting, content strategy, and partnership, an award-winning content producer and executive producer. She creates both scripted and reality show formats that enjoy multiple seasons and win awards. She has been of content committee at Moja Live, and she has been advising and contributing immensely to businesses' content strategy. A multiple award-winning producer, currently working as a senior broadcasting consultant. Welcome, Paul and Pheto.
Thank you for having us.
No, you're welcome. As we start off this program, I just want to offer my condolences to Comrade Stimela Sticks, Jacob Mokgetwa's family. Comrade Sticks was a deputy commander general of the Azanla forces. He was one of those who went to Tripoli, Libya, and trained as a cadre of Azanla forces. He came back as a commando and led our forces with gusto and with the power and the precision that was required of the leadership of Azanla at the time. Also, I offer our condolences to the Kunta family. In the last 2 days, they lost a daughter of the soil, Comrade Yoli Sakunda, who is a daughter to Comrade Vuisa Kunda and a sister to Nzinga, who was supposed to be with us this afternoon. And unfortunately, as a result of that bereavement, Nzinga had to pull out of the program. We offer our condolences to the Kunda family, to the Azapo family, and all of those who knew her and know their contributions to the struggle of our land. Today, we are going to be doing some reflections on June 16, and also reflections on the contribution, the lives, and the experiences of young people who spent the better part of their lives in exile, growing in lands foreign to their own country, and living a life that was never set for them. And here they are contributing to the advancement of our country. If you can, Paul, give us just a bit of a broad reflection on the significance of living in exile, the significance of what it means to be here 45 years after the June 16 uprisings.
Thank you for the question. I think the biggest shock that comes with having lived in exile was coming back home and realizing that the streets, I mean, you could go to schools and there are only Black people there. You could go to schools in the township and there are only Black teachers. In exile, our avenue, 56th Avenue, it was suburb. I think I considered it the township of Zimbabwe, but we lived in a house with 3 bedrooms, a separate bathroom, former toilet. They were both inside. On our street, we had people from South Africa, we had people from Europe, we had people from the Caribbean islands, and it was just a melting pot of different cultures. And then you come home and and you realize, or maybe I was blind at the time, I didn't notice it, but you were never judged on your race. You know, you were a human being. When coming back home and realizing that because you are Black, you would have lesser of, that was the biggest shock to the system. That is what growing up in exile and coming home did. And it sort of from a young age instills that, no, I do not know how to be lesser because I'm Black. There's a specific standard and a means and a way of life that I'm used to. And it's based on me being a human being and what I contribute, and not necessarily what my race is. Yeah, I think, and then from then on, I think Peter would also speak to this, because I remember our parents used to have, I wouldn't know the political term, but they would have sessions where they would go and speak about the manifesto, what needs to be done. And when you're in the room, before any meeting starts, and which is exactly what you did, there were war cries, there were songs that were sang about the state of the nation, the state of the Black mind, where one has to position themselves as a Black person, what a Black person deserves. And so I think when you come home, and when you're there, you just can't wait to come home to fight that, and to ensure that you have the rights that you're being taught from a young age to sing about. And when you come home, you expect that to be your truth. And therefore, when you came home, it was a bit of a difficulty navigating the space, because you're coming back, you have been going to multiracial schools, English is your first word, and I mean, your first language, with Shona as well, and then your Sothos, your Zulus are your third or fourth language. And so trying to integrate in the culture, it made it hard for you to interact with some of the Black people, because you could not you knew you were Black. You knew, I have to love this person because they're Black. They're a reflection of me and I'm a reflection of them. But them not coming out of that pressure cooker, you are foreign to them. And therefore trying to make relationships from that point of view was very hard. Trying to build relationships, coming back, even from a young age, and you're conscious of this. You're aware that if you go to Zimbabwe, you can easily make friends like that wherever you go, and the separate countries, because everyone is interested in your story. But when you come back home, you're a thorn.
No, that's a mouthful. Petro, you grew up in Zimbabwe. In fact, you were born in Botswana and ended up growing in Zimbabwe. I suppose you wondered how it would be like at home, and your youth, I mean, your teenage life was all in exile, basically, and not out of your making, but out of the circumstances you found yourself in. I'm sorry. Peter seems to be having connectivity problems. Maybe let's go back to you, Mpho. You were seeing all of these people making all of these slogans, and did you apportion to this kind of life that you are living? Because you are growing up in that environment, and every day you're waking up, seeing these people in meetings all the time and singing and making slogans, and all of these things, what do they mean to you?
My father was one of the Soweto 11, Photo Jefferson Lingani. And the Soweto 11 were the 11 who actually came through to also plan and contribute to June 16, you know? So the one thing my dad was always big on was me never forgetting the reasons and the context of who I am within my environment. So hearing those slogans every day, singing them every day, and having my father teach them to me every day, it was a means of him to remind me of why we're in Zimbabwe, home is South Africa. You are in exile because of the following reasons, but he wouldn't give you. Purely, I think he was trying to protect my childhood. But I knew the reason why we were in Zimbabwe was because something terrible had happened at home. All I remember was that there was a fire. Our house was petrol bombed, and we had left for our safety. So hearing the slogans, it was my father's way of reminding me that you might have it easy right now. It might seem relatively easy, but you're being prepared for the war that is back at home. So I always understood the context of that, of the fact that we're here, we're at war, we're training, we're going back to fight.
But I mean, you were very young at the time, and you were being prepared for war at a very, very tender age. Didn't you want to be young and do what young do and live a life of young people?
I did. I did want to be young, and I was young. And I think maybe in correcting the perception, it was not a you can't have a childhood. I do have memories of me playing soccer with my father, going to school with my brother, you know, but obviously the parents were more occupied with their mission. I did have a childhood. My dad protected both my parents actually protected my childhood to a large extent, and we tried to have as many childhood memories as possible. But you were never allowed to forget that you are being prepared for what is to come.
Okay. Petro, are you with us?
Yes, hi, Simpiwe. Sorry, my network connection is unusually slow, but I'm back.
Okay. Your reflections?
So when I was prompted to kind of start reflecting on what...
Something is unusually wrong with your line. Petro, can you try again? Maybe...
Yes.
Okay. No, we seem to be losing you.
Murphy's Law.
All right. Maybe, Petro, if you can just disconnect and then reconnect back, we would appreciate. There seems to be a bandwidth problem where you are. All right. So in the meantime, we'll continue with Paul. Paul is the daughter to Jefferson Lingani. Their house was and you know, it was one of those periods that we don't want to talk about, that we don't want to remember, but we are forced to remember. And when you were forced to leave the country with your parents, what did that mean to you?
I think my father left first, and he walked to Botswana to leave the country for safety purposes.
Yes.
My mother followed, and I was about a year or two when then, funny enough, Today I'm at Mapungubwe, and a few days ago I was telling my mom that I was at the Confluence. Now, if you know the Confluence here at Mapungubwe, that's where it's an open space,
Yeah.
and there's a river. On to your left-hand side is Botswana. You cross a mountain and that's Zimbabwe. If you cross the river onto the side, that's South Africa. And I
Yeah.
am there today, and I'm speaking today. And my mom was telling me, Hore, oh, you were there. That's the place where when we because her and my dad went ahead. And they met with friends and family who brought me. She says that's where they received me.
Yeah.
And we were in Botswana for a few months, and that's when the government discovered that we were in the country, and they were chased out. And then we therefore moved to Zimbabwe.
To Zimbabwe.
Yeah, we were there in Grow. I think your question is about what the pain of leaving, right, and the circumstances.
Exactly. Because
Yeah.
I mean, very young, so, and I suppose it is an experience that is told rather than experienced, right? And you were what, 1 or 2 years old when you left the country?
I was probably a year or two. And
Yeah.
and it had happened, and the reason why that had happened was because my father is the first of 4 boys.
Yeah.
My second uncle, Kelelo, who's not into politics at the time, was not as strong into politics as Kabelo and Katiso, was at home on that afternoon washing his car. And now my dad was hunted down for the contribution into the struggle. And the men who had seen my uncle thought that it was my dad. Luckily, Gelalo leaves home, but the spies who had seen him came back a few hours later, expecting to find him, thinking it's my dad, only to find out it was my grandfather, their father. He was kidnapped on that night. He was tortured. He was beaten up to death. Very terrible things were done to his body. Hence, then that led to my father and Kabelo leaving the country for their safety. I would not remember what it felt like, but the one particular moment I remember as a child was my mom running and screaming, and I'm in her hands, and on the same, I'm in her arms, and on the same evening, we were sleeping, and all I heard was a loud siren sound, a loud crash, and an explosion, and there was this big barrel of fuel that on fire that came in through through their bedroom window. Funny enough is that afternoon, my mom tells me the story that she was spring cleaning, and the window where the petrol bomb came through was where the bed was. So because she was spring cleaning, she moved the bed, and through exhaustion, she didn't push it back towards the window. One of her close friends was the one who was there marking the geography of the house that particular afternoon. And through divine intervention, I guess, my mom and her exhaustion, her not putting the bed back to its original position, that's the reason why I'm still alive. That's the reason why my brother was born, and the reason we're having this interview today. Those are the events I have shared with my parents. My mom shares the story of how she held me tight in her arms on that evening, hoping that should a bullet pierce through her back, her organs would cushion the bullet and stop it from piercing through both our bodies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember I remember sirens. I remember neighbors were out. Family members were back again. Were back at our house. We're standing outside the house while it was on fire. And not too long after that incident, I know we had left the country.
Oh, what a story. What a moving testimony to the life that we lived in the 80s. Comrade Peter, welcome back. Your reflections. It's 45 years, and after 45 years, we still have, problems of connectivity and all of that. All right, talk to us about your reflections on, growing up in Zimbabwe. Because I mean, your teenage life was all in exile, first in Botswana and then Zimbabwe. So, and when we ask you about your, the life of people of your age in South Africa, I suppose you wouldn't be able to tell because you were not there.
No. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to reflect on parts of my childhood and growing up. So when I was reflecting on the topic and those memories that we have, some of them are quite deep hidden. I think there's two sides to growing up in exile. So my situation was slightly different because I was born outside the country in Botswana, and until I was 12, the only country essentially I knew was Zimbabwe. And growing up in our household, we did not talk of South Africa, but my parents always talked of Korai. And for those who speak Sesotho language, you know that,
Yeah.
or Ekhaya, for the Nguni speaker. And so, I grew up in the shadow, you could call it the shadow of this country that is supposed to be your homeland, your ancestral home, that you've never set foot in. And also, I'd never met pretty much any of my family members outside of my parents and my sister. So Mpho, amongst other people, was the closest thing to a cousin that I would have had growing up. And like Mpho said, although there's things happening in terms of, there's always a bigger narrative, whether it's political or historical. And in some ways, you can analyze things in terms of major events like the state of emergencies in the late 80s, the Soweto uprising in the 70s. And we look at how many people left the country, what their aims were, which political powers or international powers were involved. So there's always that larger narrative, but there's also a smaller personal narrative, which for me is simply encompasses my childhood. That's essentially what exile was. I was born in exile, and as I said, until I was a teenager, my entire experience is growing up in a country where you knew it's not your ancestral home. That said, I think it was a and I think that's testament to my parents and all the people around us, the other comrades who are in exile, is I think as children, I felt I was treated as a child until I was grown up. So as much as I would, or we would hear these songs being sung, as much as we knew our parents were involved in the struggle in fighting for tokoloho, is again, that's how we were raised. As a 10-year-old, 9-year-old, you're not going to understand complex political concepts, but you at least understand that your parents had to leave a country that was not accommodating to them, and they are fighting to get back to that country and to get back a country which is better for everyone. So I think that's how I would see it. So as much as we had politics around us, I am also grateful that I had a childhood. It's a childhood of watching like any other child. We climbed trees, fell out of those trees like any other children, rode rode bicycles, fell off bicycles, and I think that's how I ended up with a scar here, which
On your knee. Yeah.
All right, that's good to hear. I mean, you found yourselves immersed in this culture of other people. Was there any yearning for your own culture back home, and how do you survive that environment where you are finding yourself immersed in this country's culture, way of doing things? Because I mean, you learned, I'm sure you are very fluent in Shona, and you learned in schools of other people, not your own countrymen's schools, not your own countrymen's culture. And the people you knew were really people who were engaged in struggle, and they were coming in and out of where you were. And their mission was all about fighting for the liberation of their own country. And whilst you were growing up in that environment, so you were the only semblance of home environment and home culture was largely due to these comrades who were coming in and out of Zimbabwe. And other than that, growing up, your friends were largely Zimbabwean friends, and your schools where you were learning were largely Zimbabwean schools, and the environment was Zimbabwean, if I may say so. And how did you survive that environment? Mpo?
I thought you were going to give it to Peter to go first. I've been holding the fort for him here in his network. Well, Peter mentioned that we wanted to come Kochai. And he mentions that rightfully so, that the closest thing to a brother for me, as opposed to a cousin, was him.
Yeah.
And yes, we grew up in Zimbabwe, but you were always aware that you were not Zimbabwean, and the closest you could get to culture was number 4 Devon. I think that's the correct address, right, Peto? And number 4 Devon was how do we call it? It was this huge house with a huge yard. It was a refugee camp, but it was in a suburb. Yes, Good Devon. And there we were surrounded by
6 Devon Avenue.
6 Devon Avenue, yes. And that is where all South Africans who are within the Black consciousness movement or from whichever political party would arrive at. And it was our second home away from our homes, And I think because of yearning for home and everybody knowing that it was more of a place where all South Africans within the consciousness movement met. So that was our experience of South African culture. To say it would not necessarily be my family, but it was a collective Black consciousness movement. And hence, then what I touched on earlier was that you expect that when you come back, you expect that the South Africans in the country are also going through the same experience and the slogans, and everyone is fighting the same fight, because I always had a vision that coming back home, everyone would have guns. I couldn't wait to come back and grow up and have my contribution, And right in the refugee camp, funny, you're talking about culture. There was military. I think we would go there and we would play with them, and they would let us hold their guns, and and then we would play. And from that age, you're used to guns. And then talking about culture, would go to Zimbabwean schools. You'd learn their songs. You'd learn the people that they are. But even though you're in Zimbabwe, you know that it is foreign. It is not yours. You were participating in it, but there was a part of you that always felt like you're a voyeur, or you didn't experience and you're doing it because it is part of the school curriculum. But you never felt rooted in it. It was something that you were doing because your friends are doing it and you're with your friends. And you would be reminded that this is not home every time you would go to the refugee camp, or you would go back home, you hear your language, your mother tongue being spoken. So there were those constant reminders that this is not forever. There is home to go back to. So it was more of an experience, the Zimbabwean culture for me as a child, as opposed to it was my identity.
Peto, I mean, your father was a commander-in-chief of an army, and you were growing up in that environment of guns, of violence, and, let's face it, anything that has to do with a gun has to do with violence. And when it happened in the country back in the 80s, in the 70s, it was violence. How did that affect you, your makeup, your personality as you were growing up in that, environment, in that culture of, a people or a group of people who had this military inclination in their makeup, in their daily life, and in everything that they were doing? It was, around, those kind of things that, a child should not be close to.
Well, I think being around guns also depends on the context of those guns. So, importantly, none of those guns was ever pointed at me. So that also affects how I would react to it. But also, to a large extent, we had responsible adults. So guns were not left lying around. So I think that's also important in terms of how I would have responded to it, or how I would have reacted to it over time. So some of the guns we saw would have been from the Zimbabwean police, because there was actually a time when the Zimbabwean police was assigned to provide security for the comrades at the home that we grew up with. So we would see guns in that context. But at least with the officials' guns, you would never, ever get to touch it. I think once or twice someone let me take a picture with one, and my parents still have a picture with me at Zimbabwe's Heroes Acre holding an AK-47. But also, again, the context, this was more me as a child. Growing up, we all grew up playing cops and robbers with water pistols. And probably in the 80s, no one had a big problem with children playing with toy guns, unlike children being raised nowadays, where we now see it as a bit problematic. But importantly, none of those guns ever felt like a threat to me. I think that's important. And I never grew up playing with guns. So I don't think I would traumatized in any way. And then just back to your about surviving the different cultures. To a large extent, I think our parents tried to maintain some connection with our mother cultures. And the most important is probably the fact that we were all allowed to, not allowed, but they promoted the use of our home languages, which is why as a 12-year-old, I arrived, as I said, a country I'd never set foot in, which was my ancestral. I could at least speak to most people. Although I spoke with a funny accent, my Sepedi struggled when I got to high school, because I was not raised speaking Sepedi as such. But now I Sepedi in school, and my friends all spoke Sepedi, and so I was this weirdo who spoke Sepedi in a funny way and seemed to be a foreigner. But I think that head start, at least in terms of we grew up speaking our home language in one form or another. In itself, I think language is one of the most important ways of rooting someone into any culture. In terms of Zimbabwe itself, being so young, I don't think we would appreciate the nuances and the differences between one culture and another. But bear in mind, really big differences between cultures of Black people in Southern Africa. There's quite a lot of similarities in language, quite a lot of similarities in culture as well. Obviously, being young, we would not have participated in some of the core cultural practices. So obviously me and Mpho, none of us had to get married in a country with a different culture or have to go through burial procedures in a country with the different cultures. But overall, speaking this language and being mentally prepared that there's a day where you will have to return.
Yeah, it was something. There's, somebody, I think it's one of Pale's sons, who is reflecting on Facebook about, his own experience living with their parents, and he spent his time there until he came back in 1994, and he relates on Facebook how difficult the situation was. Can you relate to that? Do you know who I'm talking about? He's one of Frans Pale's sons.
So he's one of?
Comrade Frans Pale's sons.
Okay. And he also grew up in Zim with us, right?
And I think he spent most of his time in the Dukwa camps in Botswana. So I'm not too sure if he lived with you afterwards, but is relating how difficult it was, to survive, the exile experience. Do you share the same sentiments?
I think the one thing, having my father and his brother living in exile and Peto's family, which were nuclear families, 3 nuclear families, the Kunta family as well. I'm trying to remember Auntie Mbali and Uncle Joey, and they were also a nuclear family. That refugee camp and all of us being within the same suburb, which would be Hague Park. I remember being in Hague Park. I remember I could walk to Peto's house, which was about a 5-10 kilometer walk. I could walk to the Kunta family home. I could walk to Auntie Mbali's house. I could walk to my uncle's house. So we never felt, well, I'll speak for myself. It was never that difficult for me because all these nuclear families, and we're all the same age, and we all had some form of home. It did not make it that difficult. I think I would not know at what age. Sorry, who did you say the gentleman's name was?
Frans Pale.
Frans Pale. I don't know at what age Frans would have left for Botswana, but if all you know, I remember seeing my friends whom I would later grow up with for the first time when they were speaking Shona, trying to integrate and make friends with them and not being able to hear what they're saying and learn the language through them and via school. I think my dad always had a thing of making everything that I go through feel like an experience and an adventure. And always having that adult to remind you of context, of why you're here, what is happening. anything that's new that appears in your life or that plays out. That might have made it easier for me to cope.
Okay.
For weekends and weeks, Peter and I and Yoli would be left together. We'd be left at the Kunta household. And I have pictures of us actually all children South African in Zim. And I think because there were so many children who were South African within our immediate space with all our South African parents, that might have made it easier for us to cope. Had it all been my parents on their own, I think maybe it would have been a different story.
Okay. Now, Peter, you found yourself having to come back in 1994 and having to be enrolled in, a school in South Africa. How did you find the education system in South Africa compared to what you were introduced to in Zimbabwe?
Well, so my transition from the Zimbabwean school system into the South African education system coincided with, that transition from primary school to high school. So I completed my primary school up to grade 7 in Zim, and then here I had to start high school. So in a sense, I was to some extent mentally prepared that something is changing because, you go from what they call the small school to the big school. So there was already a sense that something would have to change. You could pick up differences between what we had learned, say, in Zimbabwe versus what we would be learning this side. But because it was all part of a larger transition, I don't think one can analyze it like an educationist would in terms of the differences. But what colored the experience more than educational systems, the technical details, was just context. As I said, I had to now learn how to speak Sepedi amongst teenagers, and you can imagine teenage boys standing out is not always good for you. It makes you the target of a number of jokes and the first 2 years were difficult in that sense, but still, children are children, and I still managed to build, very strong friendships, and I had good teachers at a good school, so that smoothed the experience quite a bit.
Okay, and what was your biggest shock when you came back?
Language genuinely was my biggest struggle.
Other than that, everything was like, okay, I'll get past this.
Yeah.
But all right.
The foundation of at least being raised speaking some form of Sesotho or Setswana, that found invaluable, because without it, I genuinely would have struggled to immerse myself. And, I often feel pain when I meet, some of my peers have children who are now 12 years old, 13 years old, who do not speak an African language. And you see them once they're outside of the malls and outside of the school environment, somehow they end up visiting the family at the township, and they struggle. And I genuinely feel their pain, but I also then acknowledge how important it was that we were raised speaking our mother tongue, and that made the transition a lot easier.
And Paul, when they said to you, okay, we're going to Kaya, and what did that mean to you, going back home? I mean, having been of how you left the country and why you left the country, and now we're going back Kaya. How make you feel?
Well, luckily for me, there would be times when I would come back into the country, over the school holidays, and I'd go back. So I remember my first conscious visit into the country was that, Black people don't have tarred roads. They live on gravel. And I remember seeing a donkey pulling a charcoal cart. And I remember feeling, yo, this is Africa, because when we were growing, in the part of Zimbabwe that we're growing up in was well developed, and like Peto says, language was the biggest of them all, which was a big shock, in that you wanted to speak in your mother tongue with Black people, and knowing that you're speaking it with an accent, and knowing that you're not safe. Someone is about to tease you based on your accent. And I remember I used to say and as opposed to so I'd have extra body, and getting shouted at, even not only teased but also getting reprimanded for not speaking the language the way it's supposed to be spoken. The underdeveloped Black neighborhoods was also a big shock. Seeing where you came from, which was also a predominant Black area, but we had water, we had electricity, and seeing how that was a privilege, having to wash, learning to wash in this is having a big tub for high, a house with a 4-roomed house versus you are 8, 9 years old and you have your own room. And how this was normal, some of the other the shock was, and it's something I struggled with for a long time, was when you're with the Black people, you are not Black enough. And when there were certain white children because we would go to missionary schools, and with some of the white children you could fit in, but based on knowing why life had played out for you the way it had, there was constantly an internal fight and an internal battle over, am I now betraying my people by being closer to white people because they accept you and I'm far more accepting of you compared to Black people. So for the longest time, that was what I had to fight and had to battle with. You'd asked about the schooling system. When I came back, I was supposed to go to, I think, to grade 3. Oh yeah, then there was the grades and the standards. Yeah. In Zimbabwe, it's grades, and then this side it's standards, and always having to remember, okay, you go forwards, you count backwards. When you count forwards, when you count backwards, and also having to go to remedial school, in order for your parents to help you get off the trauma, allow you to get over what you've seen, and what you experience, so that you can be easily integrated again. Would you like me to change my background? I see I'm getting silhouettes.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I'm okay. No, unless it's creative problems for you.
No, it is not.
Okay. Now, Peto, what types of books did you grow up reading?
So at that age, I was a big fan of a teenage detectives series. So some of you may have heard of the Hardy Boys series.
Yeah.
That we read, me and my friends, the friend group I had around me, most of whom were, in fact, all of them were Zimbabwean kids. And we saw each other as the same, and we used to have a public library that we could walk to as a group. It was actually
Yeah.
we grew up with. I think once a week we would walk to the library, drop off one set of books and sign out the next set of books. And that was the one that I read a lot because, again, at that age, you do what other people do. And friend groups were fans of the detective series. But it's also where I got to develop a love for science. So among I would read books about dinosaurs and how the universe was formed and the like. And I think that played a big role in my later career in a science-based profession. And it's only when we were at teenage years, already back in Korai, when we started exploring now the African Writers series and the like.
Okay. But I suppose, growing up in an environment where there was a lot of political education, it would be fair to say all of you grew up as conscious young Black people, right? And did that not create a bit of dissonance with the circles of friends that you were finding back home when you came back?
Yeah, that's a fair question. But again, remember, below 12, how complex is one's understanding of
life.
history. Beyond, as I said, that Mpo seems to have a greater grasp of it, even though we're the same age. But I guess at that age, I was genuinely a child. I can't see it differently from that. But I still think we were aware of the overarching theme that we are not in our country and we're not there in a country that is unfriendly and frankly intolerable to someone of my skin culture. We grew up with that. But equally, we grew up with the best of what Black consciousness is all about. I think apart from that philosophy, we essentially imbibed it around us, and it plays a part in who we are, who we were growing up, because of the songs we sang, but also people were very clear that Black is beautiful. I grew up with that phrase, Black is beautiful. Maybe I didn't understand the depth of what that means. I didn't always understand the pain that other people went. It's only now as an adult that I now understand that a lot of the comrades who were with us had gone through true horrors, either in the 70s and the 80s. As I said, I really did not, but they genuinely imbibed in us this sense of Black pride, even growing up. And the Black consciousness handshake as children, it's now second nature that's what we grew up with. We grew up with the music that people chose to play. I'm sure Mpo can still remember us learning the lyrics to Tracy Chapman's.
Yeah.
That was the most popular bootlegged cassette. Those were the days of bootlegged cassette tapes, and everyone at Devon Avenue was playing Tracy Chapman and Whitney Houston, and we grew up singing those songs. The games that they taught us was chess. So chess was a popular pastime among some of the younger comrades. It's only now I realized they would have been in their early 20s. Again, at 8 years old, you don't realize and recognize this, that these comrades who are around you are essentially traumatized children who were to flee the country of their birth and leave their families behind. But amongst other things, they taught us to play chess. And one thing I remember, frankly, is, in chess, you always have to choose a side, white versus black. And I still remember someone saying to me, always choose black when you're playing. Obvious reasons. So the spirit of the place and people's genuine passion and revolutionary passion did eventually seep into us, even if we were relatively young and couldn't always understand things as adults. But because we were not adults, we really were children.
Yeah. And they made sure that you were not immersed in adult things, and they made sure that you grew up as children that you were, I suppose.
I think we knew I think is an important part of raising any child is still know who they are. If you're in China, you may not understand the complexities of Mao's thought, but surely a child growing up in China knows they have a history that stretches thousands of years and contributions to science and the like. So in some ways, we knew who we were. We were Azania's children who were waiting to return home. That's, I think, who we were raised at.
Yeah. And just to add moments to what Peto is talking about, I think because for the longest time it was only you and I who were the children in the who were constantly at Devon, and Peto and I were always made to compete, and that was the other thing. There was never a girl or boy. We were always, I remember being asked to compete who could do the most push-ups. The bike accident and his scar that he references, I remember that was on the day that we were both being taught how to ride a bike. Peto fell off the bike, and I remember seeing, he's the only person who I've seen dark red blood come from. And he got up on the bike and he rode again. I remember the day we were both getting taught how to swim. Someone came and pulled Peto out because he almost drowned. And on that day, that's the day he also learned how to swim, because that incident happened, but he was pushed and encouraged to go back into the water and swim again. And that's the spirit we were raised with as children. No matter how hard, you always get back into. And on the day that Peto fell, and got his scar, I remember on that day he got back on the bike again and he rode. It was unfortunate for me. I saw him bleed and I had to go after. And all the things he would always throw himself straight into, because Mpo can't start at the same time as me, and all the accidents would happen going, and then it gets worse. But I'd also get thrown into it. Now this is coming back to the childhood and being raised, but we're always raised that no matter what happens, you get up and you get back in. And you never fear danger, never failing, never fear falling, never fear pain.
I'm in conversation with Paul Lingani, the daughter of the late comrade Jefferson Lingani, and Dr. Peto Mangena, the son of Ndete Musuburi Mangena. They are reflecting on their experiences of growing up in exile. You're more than welcome to converse with them, engage and raise your hands and make comments through the Q&A tab on your Zoom, or you can ask them any questions of your interest. Peto, you came back in 1994, and when we were told that we are free as a people, what did that mean to you? When you reflect back, I mean, you were young, you were 12-year-old when you come back, but when you reflect back, growing up in an environment of struggle, in an environment where you had been surrounded by people who were fighting for freedom. And now, as a young adult, looking back and saying, you know, I spent all my childhood life in exile amongst people who were fighting for freedom. We are now told that the country is free. And here you are reflecting back. What do you say to yourself and other young people?
Well, I think that was a confusing time in a sense, because I was now on the threshold of teenagehood. So I was 12 going on 13, about to start high school. And the first thing is obviously outside the country. This was when Mandela Mania, for lack of a better word, was close to its height. If you recall, he would have been inaugurated in '94, and he was essentially the darling of the world. And even back then in Zimbabwe, that sense seeped into it. However, I do think growing up in the Black consciousness movement meant we could pick up this sense of hesitancy on the part of the older generation who probably saw it, the so-called freedom, as not being the true freedom that it was supposed to be. So that was confusing for me as I think as a pre-teenager. On the one hand, there's this vibe that, oh, South Africa is suddenly free thanks to Mandela, but on the other hand, you are getting a completely different perspective from your parents, and because you are now at that age, you can start analyzing, start looking at things and trying to balance these two views, which don't seem to align with themselves. So that was quite a lot of a bit of confusion, and I think this is where the dissonance you mentioned probably applies, because the outside world was telling you you're in this country which has pulled off a miracle, but you know, because you sit next to your parents, you hear them on the phone, and I think that was roughly the age I would start reading papers. So you see opinion pieces, including those written by our parents and their generation, and you now hear these conversations with a different ear because you're now old enough to hear when people talk politics. That was a bit of confusion for me, but I think we all can acknowledge that 26 years from that from that time, they were probably right. The freedom that was painted as the end of all the troubles was not the freedom that they sacrificed so much for, and that those who were inside also suffered so much for. I think it's now apparent that that point of view was probably correct, that we had not really, it was not Uhuru, as later tells us.
Mpho, I mean, you grew up in an environment where your parents kept reminding you never to forget, right? Never to forget the pain, never to forget where you come from, and never to forget the life that the family experienced. How do you feel when you reflect back? You know, do you really feel that you should be hating those people who did what they did in the name of struggle? And when you look back in the life that you lived and having achieved what you have achieved and contributing in the manner in which you are doing now to the advancement of this country, what are your views about the life that you have lived and the pain that you have suffered and where we come from as a country?
Till today, we every June 16, we meet at my grandmother's house. And we are reminded of the importance of the day. And by we, I mean the remainder of my uncles, all my cousins and my grandmother. And she tells us stories of that particular day, the events leading up to, fighting to get Mama Sibongile Mkhabela out of prison. If you remember, the Lingani household for the Black consciousness was one of the homes where majority of our fathers and leaders would meet and plan. And my grandmother never lets us forget that. And she never lets us forget who is doing what currently. I mean, when was it? A day after you got in touch with me, I got in touch with my father and Tate William Nam. He hated when I called him my uncle. And I told him that I would be in the meeting with you and in the session with you. A day after, my grandmother calls me and tells me, Richard, you'll be on the platform. So through our uncles as well, we're also constantly in content and in Christmas. And I was telling Peter the other day that why don't you ever return my calls? Over so many years, I've been asking your dad to tell you to call me. We're never meant to forget. And even with the pain and the deaths of our family members and the deaths of our family members and close friends, we will sit and recollect. And it is mainly a taking an account of what has happened in the past for you to be able to enjoy to a certain degree what the people before you went through, what they experienced, the pain they experienced, the lives that were lost, the sacrifices for who you are. And in us being told this, we're all also expected to have our children there. And it's a big session where we all sit around the table and we hear of these stories and we hear of the experiences, so that at all times when you're moving within yourself and within your purpose, you do not forget. I remember a beautiful story of Kabelo. We had gone to a very expensive, one of these Michelin restaurants. And our waiter did not know the difference between a red wine glass and a white wine glass. And he took the time out while the gentleman was serving us to say to him, how long have you been working here for? The gentleman explained to me that it had been, I think, a week or two. And throughout our dining experience while we're there, Kabelo took it upon him to teach him the finer details of fine dining and explaining to him the importance of why he's investing in him as a Black man at a restaurant where you will not necessarily see a lot of Black people. And this is a lesson that I also take forward. When I see a Black person struggling, and if I am well equipped and well blessed within that space, I am compelled to hold that Black person's hand through the experience and to, I don't want to say teach, but to guide them through and to share my experience and my knowledge. And this is how I page through, even with my child. You see her in how she wants to be strong in family history, how when she goes to places of, in her mindset already, she's already wanting to change spaces in which Black people who are underprivileged live in. You know, it's a mindset thing. It's constantly within the little bit that you can do in that particular day. When you go to bed, do you feel? But you're not going out hunting or want to find a Black person who doesn't know. You know, so within experiences, should you come across someone who would benefit from the knowledge and from being seen, because that was one thing that exile does. You did not come back not wanting to feel seen. You knew that it is you had to depend on, you know, and to some unfortunate degree, apartheid has the after effects of it has taught a sense of I have to be seen, I have to be acknowledged for me to feel human. And with this, you would find that majority people would be shy to put themselves out there. And through understanding that, for me, that is my biggest contribution to the Black community at large. Investing in self and being a strong believer in who you are, and knowing that it all starts with you seeing yourself and understanding that you're powerful enough, even as an individual, to within your circle or the spaces that you find yourself moving within.
Wow. Peto, you were saying earlier on that you grew up in an environment where you now realize that the people that you were with in Zimbabwe were very young, in their 20s, left the country, not out of choice, but out of circumstance, running away from being arrested, from being killed, and engaging in struggle. And here we are, and some of whom are, the victims of the June 16th that we are commemorating. And today being told that, June 16th is a youth day to celebrate young people throwing bashes and, enjoying themselves as if people did not, as if it was a day made to be celebrated. How do you reflect on that?
Well, I think that was one of the biggest errors of post-94 society, was to rebrand day with fluffy sounding terms like Youth Day or Reconciliation. I mean, you see still talk of what do they call them? Service delivery protests. Instead of calling it what it is, it's a riot because of people are unhappy. We still call it industrial action, which is a vague sounding word, which probably could imply a lawyer writing a letter, but industrial action is a strike. And we carry this on, this society. We carry on this rebranding to be almost, I don't want to say non-offensive, but this rebranding which takes us away from the heart of what's really going on. So June 16, and I think that's the problem, because once you change the name, it implies it's a day that people sat down and decided, well, we probably needed one day in the year to talk about the youth of the country, and there's all these campaigns. So I know in the media it's popular, for instance, that in Youth Month, so-called youth become editors of special editions, or they direct a particular show. But I think it then divorces us from the reality of what really happened on June 16. And what happened on June 16 was young people realized the system was really against them and was against their parents. The system was crushing their parents. The system was insulting their parents. Not to mention the system had them had planned a life for them where they would only be domestic workers and minors. And these young people took the initiative and said they would not stand up to this. Calling it Youth Day divorces us from the, how do I call it? The resolve that they showed, the determination that they showed, and also takes away from the genuine pain of what was, at the end of the day, a massacre. This was not, as you say, it's now just an excuse to have parties and like. And if people want to party, that's their own choice. But I think if the leadership of a country makes that deliberate effort to rebrand its own history, I mean, why is the 16th of, is it the 16th of December called Reconciliation Day? A battle fought around that day. And obviously people trace their history to different sides of that battle, but call it what it was. And then we can talk about, do we take the lesson of reconciliation from that day or not? But don't change the name, because then that changes the whole commemoration. Those who are religious get very, I know a family member gets very upset when Christmas is abbreviated to Xmas, because for them it's the Christ out of Christmas. Now, that's an example of how rebranding changes the meaning. And that's the problem with June 16. It has been rebranded, and therefore it's difficult to then reconnect with the meaning of that day, the pain of that day, but also the optimism that comes from young people deciding enough is enough, the determination that they showed. We take a lot away from that just with the simple act of rebranding. And it makes you wonder why we need to run away from it, as if it's, as much as there's pain, it's not an embarrassing day in Black people's, or indeed in the greater people in Azania/South Africa. It is an important day, and we keep running away from it with our attempts to rebrand it. And you wonder why. What do we have to be embarrassed about? If anything, we should be embarrassed about the way that generation was treated. I count myself lucky that post 94, I had opportunities, doors that were opened that allowed me to get to where I am. I know a lot of people from that generation never got those opportunities. And on the one hand, we've let them down as a society, as a country, by not giving them their due, but we further let them down by not recognizing the pain that they went through, the sacrifice, the blood that they shed, but also not recognizing how positive they were. They became actors instead of being passive. And so we do need to, I think there's a question in the chat about commemoration, and you can't commemorate to change its name. My birthday will always be my birthday. So we celebrate it as the day Petro was born. The same way we celebrate my birthday. But if you change my birthday to, well, it's just before winter, our last day to have fun before winter, it changes the meaning. I think we need to go back to June 16 should be Soweto Day or Soweto Uprising Day. That's what it was. Or Soweto Students Uprising. That's what it was. We can draw lessons from it about the youth and so on, but don't change fundamentally what the day is about.
Yeah. Paul, I mean, if you look at young people in the now, growing up and living in an environment of the so-called freedom, and some of them pivoting into, different lives that they would otherwise have not lived if it was not for the conditions that they were subjected to. And when you reflect at young people today, what do you think it is that they are burdened with that you as a community of young people should contribute to resolving?
That is a bit of a tough question. It's a bit of a tough question, but I am going to attempt to answer it to the best of my capability. I think if there's one thing, sorry, it's the sun is setting, so mosquitoes in the safari. With every generation that comes, everyone has their own struggle.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring back the example of the pressure cooker. Only a handful of people were in that pressure cooker versus the amount of South Africans who remained in the country, the South Africans who were not in exile, who were not fighting. So from a point of view of what you have experienced, there's only so much more that you can do. And the war was for all.
Mm-hmm.
The war was for a freer South Africa for all Black people. But the term, and I like what Peter says, because that's what I also always fall back on. The term freedom might not necessarily have had the same context for everyone.
Yes.
For others, freedom could have meant the ability to move around. To others, freedom could have meant a better education because I can move around, therefore I can go to better schools. And therefore, me moving out of a township to a suburb or from a shack, a village, that for me, that's freedom. And it's a gentle balance when it comes to what is it of you when you're imposing of yourself and your ideologies, understanding the reason for wanting to impose for a better good for all.
Mm-hmm.
And when do you say, I will teach all for this better, all for the better? So my approach generally to life is never, I am going to do this to get people to come on board and to persuade. My approach is always what am I doing? And within the immediate spaces and in the structures and the people I'm working with, what is the influence and who is biting? It's more of a show and tell, and gunning people to gain interest in what you do, in the goal that you have put in front. And more of a mindset change. You know, I think if they were, what I love doing more than anything is a mindset change. Understanding the context of where you are and not necessarily always imposing onto the youth, because I think that is where we lose them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a approach where you get them to, first and foremost, go and find out about your grandfather. Go and find out about who he is. Find out about your family, where they come from. Do you have a totem? And because apartheid broke a lot of Black families, you realize that there's still quite a lot of trauma that people are still living with. And how then do you come through and impose an ideology and a way of life when the trauma has not yet been dealt with? When the context of the broken family has not yet been dealt with? when the trauma of understanding that, yes, you're in a township, but within your space, there's so much more that you can do. And it's not, because this is the space that I was born into, everyone has been living with this, therefore I must also accept. So there's quite a lot. And if my biggest contribution, I'd really, really, really would love to break down the psychology of apartheid and share that. And to some extent, at a primary school level, teach psychology the way it was taught to me by my father. The understanding and the deep sense of belief of self. I think that's a greater justice to the Black child. Finding purpose and beauty in your skin, in yourself, in your ability, and in, once again, if you drown, get back in the pool and swim. If you fall off the bike and you bleed, get back on the bike. And that is what I do in my small way with young minds. Try and bring them up as much as possible to believe in themselves.
Thanks for the share. Peto, you were saying earlier that you find yourself very lucky. I mean, you are a doctor, you're a nephrologist, and a lot of people who have the kind of qualifications that you have wouldn't be bothering themselves with issues of freedom, with issues, that impact on, society. They will be focusing on themselves. And the majority of some of the learned young people that you find now are so focused on individualism, individualistic careers, and they're not caring much about what is happening in their surroundings. How do you make this freedom free for those that believe that they are not free, and for those whom you believe need freedom the most, as we conclude this conversation?
Yeah. I think it's all about trying to live the freedom you believe in and trying to make it a reality for the people around you. So, for instance, I work in medicine, but also specifically in academic medicine, where I'm responsible for teaching and mentoring a new generation of doctors. But I also sit in administration, and this means I have a role to play in making some parts of our society fairer, more just, and by definition, more free. Because I was speaking about how we are not yet at the freedom that a lot of people have said they fought for. Why are the students who have to riot once again allowed to learn? It's obviously a complicated discussion about who pays, but why should a student have to riot to be allowed to learn? Why are they still rioting about a curriculum that is unfriendly and does not seem to recognize the worth of people? And so I have to realize my position gives me the ability to be part of the mechanics of that whole discussion and evolution. So for instance, not long ago, I was sitting in a meeting where we had to look at the selection criteria for my university to take on new doctors who was studying medicine. And amongst other things, we had to look at, are we fair if we look only at marks, or should we be looking at reserving places, let's say, for schools of a certain quintile? That schools tend to be divided into quintiles based on their resources and where they are. And if, for instance, we reserve places for students only from rural schools, or we reserve a proportion of spaces for students from lower quintile schools, that makes a difference to the child of a farm worker who, to all intents and purposes, has the capability to be where I am in 10, 15 years, but can't access funding or can't even get into the running for a position at school if we only look at the entirety of your metric marks. So I think that's one way we can try to bring about the real freedom that should be there, which is a society that is just, that is equitable, and that is fair in many instances and allows people to grow. And so my best way to bring that about is to use the position I can get myself to, the skills I have, not just to make a living in simple terms, but to make a difference in our society in a way that resonates with that freedom that you want for the next generation. I don't think we want in 10 years still people to be marching and burning because there's no medicine at a clinic, or there are no doctors because all doctors. I want to be in a position where in 20 years we can say I've groomed and trained a generation that is willing to work in the most rural of places. Because what is freedom if you can't get safe delivery for a pregnant woman? What is freedom if the elderly do not get relief for something as simple as osteoarthritis? And what is freedom if a child in South Africa today still dies from diarrhea because there's no piping? With all the equipment and machines and money we have, children still die from diarrhea. What freedom is there? This is what they mean by you can't eat the word freedom. You can only eat food which comes from a society which provides food. You can only be free in a society that allows you to be healthy enough to enjoy your freedom. And you can only be free if your society allows you the opportunity to live off the sweat of your brow. Funny enough, we don't allow that to people. There's always a place to assist the needy and those who struggle. For instance, someone who's disabled and cannot work. But we don't give people the opportunity to realize that human potential to work and live off the sweat of their brow. So depending on where we are, we contribute to that freedom by trying to live that freedom and trying to make it real.
Dr. Peter Mangen and Paul Lingani, comrades of the Black Consciousness Movement who grew up in exile, thank you for your reflections, and it's been a good afternoon, I think, well spent, and all those who were connected have listened to your stories, have learned from your stories, and I'm sure that they will be able to take the learnings forward in pursuit of a better life for our people. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for spending the time with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Sunday the 20th of June, I will be playing host to the activists of June 16. The people who were there, the people who left this country for exile, to contribute, to continue fighting for our struggle. Thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us. We look forward to spending the next Sunday afternoon with you, same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Listen, the struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back.